Hello everyone. This is going to be the last video that I make going through the Monopoly lecture notes. I decided to make this video solely focused on the very last slide in the lecture notes because I think it is a very good way to kind of tie up all of the ideas and concepts that we learned throughout all of these different Monopoly videos. After this video, if you feel pretty confident about the information, I do recommend that you move ahead to the final video in the series. It is called Monopoly Practice Quiz. So after this video, there will be a practice quiz where you can, test your knowledge and see how well you've done retaining all of the information. But this video is going to focus on this last slide here in the lecture notes, and it kind of ties back to the ideas that we introduced in the very first video of the series. So thinking back to that very first video, remember I drew out that spectrum of competition. And at one end of the spectrum, where there's very, very high competition, we have perfectly competitive markets. At the other end of the spectrum that has very, very low competition, we have monopoly. And I mentioned that, because these different market structures are on complete opposite ends of the spectrum, there aren't going to be very many similarities between these two. And hopefully, throughout the videos, and you've seen that there are quite a few differences between these two different market structures. However, I do want to point out on the slide, we have some similarities that are between these two different types of market structures. And, one seems pretty straightforward, but it is important to remember that whether a firm is in a perfectly competitive setting or they're the only firm making a good or a service, or if they're a monopoly, the goal of the firm that we assume in economics is that they want to maximize their profits. So no matter if it's competition or monopoly, the goal of the firm is to make profits as large as possible. Not marginal revenue, not total revenue. They want to maximize their profits. And the rule for maximizing these profits is choosing a quantity where marginal revenue is exactly equal to marginal cost. So again, it doesn't matter if we're talking about perfectly competitive firms or monopolies. The way that these firms choose the quantity to produce is exactly the same. They want the money that they're bringing in from that unit to exactly equal how much it makes to cost that unit. And we also learn that firms in perfectly competitive settings and in monopoly settings can earn short-run economic profits. Where they deviate is the long run. So in the long run, we learn that because other firms are allowed to enter the market in perfectly competitive settings, we see that profits are basically driven down to zero long-run economic profits for perfectly competitive firms. But because there is no competition for a monopoly, they're able to still charge a higher price than their marginal cost, so they're able to earn economic profits even in the long run. So let's also point out a few other differences between these two different market structures because there are quite a few of them. Another one that seems, kind of obvious is that there is a big difference between the number of firms that are operating and producing in perfectly competitive markets versus a monopoly market. So in a perfectly competitive situation, we have many, many, many firms selling the exact same good. Where if there's a monopoly, there's only one firm making the good or service that we're talking about. There is a difference in the relationship between the marginal revenue that a perfectly competitive firm brings in versus the marginal revenue that a monopoly is able to bring in. For a perfectly competitive firm, the marginal revenue that they bring in is exactly equal to the price. And we see that no matter what quantity a perfectly competitive firm produces, this price and this marginal revenue stay consistent or constant across all different quantities. For a monopoly, we learn that the price that the monopolist is able to charge is going to be greater than the marginal revenue that they bring in, or this monopoly markup. So the price that they're able to charge is greater than the marginal revenue that they bring in. Or you can also think about it as the marginal revenue that they bring in is going to be less than the price that they charge. Either way, this inequality, you can flip it either way. But just remember, price is going to be bigger than marginal revenue for a monopoly. For perfect competition, these two things are equal. When it comes to the price in terms of marginal cost, we've learned that in perfect competition, these two things are equal. But for a monopoly, they're able to charge a price that is higher than the marginal cost to them. So this is why that they're able to make not only short-run profits, but long-run profits, because the extra cost that it takes to produce one more unit is less than the price that they're able to charge and bring in for that unit. We also spent a video talking about the welfare implications of a monopoly. And we learned that the welfare maximizing level of output, or the output that maximizes total surplus, is not chosen by the monopolist. It is chosen, however, by firms in perfect competition. In other words, the quantity that the monopolist chooses creates what we discussed in the video, a deadweight loss. So this basically means that the size of the economic pie shrinks for both consumers and producers when the monopoly chooses the quantity. This is not the case in perfect competition. Perfect competition maximizes the total surplus or the total welfare of both consumers and producers. This one also seems kind of straightforward. In perfectly competitive situations, firms are free to enter the market and start producing both in the short term and in the long term. So there's this consistent, or not consistent, but there's this kind of endless cycle of firms entering a perfectly competitive market and then maybe exiting or shutting down in the long run. But with a monopoly, no one else can really enter the market. We have one firm that sets up shop, and whether this firm exists by itself due to natural processes or legal processes, no one else can really compete with them in the short run or in the long run. And then the last thing that is on this slide that's worth mentioning is that in perfect competition, the price that the perfectly competitive firm charges is consistent no matter what quantity is produced, or no matter who the perfectly competitive firm is selling the good or the service to. They can't change up the price based on the person's age or any other factors about the buyer, that a monopolist may be able to exploit different characteristics of different types of people. So we talked about price discrimination in terms of, movie tickets being different prices at different times, airline tickets being, cheaper on different days versus weekends. We also talked about, everyone may pay a different price for your college education based on scholarships and other things like that. And a monopolist is able to charge a different price for different types of people. If the monopolist is able to perfectly price discriminate or know everyone's exact willingness to pay for this good that the monopoly is producing, then it kind of gets rid of what we talked about, this deadweight loss. But this perfect price discrimination is only something that exists in theory. It's only something that exists when we draw the pictures. And in the real world, it's kind of hard for one firm to know every single person's exact willingness to pay for a good or a service that we're talking about. So again, I decided to make this video separate because I think that really understanding the subtle similarities and probably the bigger differences between these two different market structures will really kind of help you wrap your head around this spectrum of competition that kind of is this overarching theme throughout all of the topics for this next exam coming up. And it may also really help set the stage for the videos that are going to be posted next week. So the videos next week, to give you a little preview, are going to be talking about market structures that exist in between these two extremes. So we have perfect competition on one end of the spectrum and monopoly on the other end of the spectrum. Next week, we're going to introduce two different market structures that lie in the middle of perfect competition and monopoly. And these are monopolistic competition and oligopoly. So these two types of market structures that exist in the middle of the spectrum are more likely to, occur in the real world. We have more examples of these different types of market structures because these two extremes are, pretty extreme, which means they're pretty rare. It's pretty rare to have a perfectly competitive market structure, and it's also pretty rare to have only one firm making all of a good or a service. Most of the time we have maybe 2 or 3 firms making something, or we don't have every single firm selling exactly the same thing in terms of, purely perfect competition. So next week we're going to talk about different market structures that exist in between these two extremes. But understanding, the similarities and differences between these two extremes, I think is really helpful for you guys to understand. So if you haven't had time to take notes on all of these topics yet, I would pause the video and make sure you write down your own little chart in your notes about all of the similarities and differences between these two extremes. And like I mentioned in the beginning of the video, the final video in this Monopoly series is what's called the Monopoly practice quiz. So once you finish this video, the next video is going to be a practice quiz where you can see how well you've been, retaining all of this material so far.